The easiest people to underestimate are often the ones carrying the greatest responsibility. Every morning before sunrise, Eleanor Brooks unlocked the side entrance of the Hayes estate with the same small brass key she had carried for more than 30 years. The enormous mansion rested on a quiet hill overlooking the rolling countryside outside Franklin, Tennessee, its stone walls glowing softly beneath the first light of dawn. While the wealthy family still slept beneath imported linen sheets and handcrafted oak ceilings, Eleanor quietly began another day that looked almost identical to every day before it. She switched on the kitchen lights, brewed fresh coffee exactly the way Mr. Harold Hayes had preferred years earlier, prepared homemade biscuits from a recipe older than anyone living in the house, polished the marble countertops until they reflected the warm morning light, and opened the tall windows overlooking gardens she had personally planted decades ago. Every movement appeared ordinary, practiced, almost invisible. That was precisely how everyone in the family preferred it. By 7 o'clock the mansion slowly awakened. Victoria Hayes entered first, dressed in expensive athletic clothing while speaking into a wireless headset about investment meetings and property valuations. Without looking toward Eleanor, she picked up a cup of coffee already waiting on the island. "A little colder than yesterday," she said before walking away. There was no greeting. "No thank you." Eleanor simply nodded once and quietly adjusted the coffee warmer for the following morning. A few minutes later Michael Hayes entered while reading financial reports on his tablet computer. He glanced briefly toward the breakfast table before speaking. "Did someone move the blue folder from my office?" Eleanor calmly answered, "It is inside the second drawer beneath your grandfather's desk. You placed it there after your meeting on Tuesday." Michael walked upstairs, returned less than a minute later carrying the folder, and continued reading as though locating lost documents inside a 40-room mansion required no explanation. He never questioned how she remembered such details. He simply accepted that somehow she always knew where everything belonged. The youngest daughter, Olivia, entered last. Unlike her older siblings, she offered Eleanor a small smile each morning. "Good morning, Miss Eleanor." Eleanor returned the smile warmly. "Good morning, Olivia." Before another word could be exchanged, Victoria interrupted from across the dining room. "Olivia, stop bothering the housekeeper. We have enough to do today." Olivia quietly lowered her eyes and joined the family breakfast. Eleanor continued arranging fresh flowers inside a crystal vase as though she had not heard the remark at all. She had long ago learned that silence often protected dignity better than unnecessary arguments. The Hayes estate had once been known throughout the county not only for its size but for the generosity of its original owners. Harold Hayes and his late wife Margaret had opened their home to charity fundraisers, scholarship dinners, church gatherings, and countless community events. Their names remained respected throughout Franklin. Since Harold's passing nearly a year earlier, however, the atmosphere inside the mansion had slowly changed. Conversations no longer centered around family traditions or community service. Instead they revolved around appraisals, investments, legal documents, and estimated property values. Every antique became a financial asset. Every painting became an auction figure. Every acre of land became another calculation. Eleanor quietly dusted the library shelves while those conversations drifted through the open doors. She never interrupted. Yet she listened carefully because every room inside the house carried memories that numbers could never measure. She paused briefly before an old black and white photograph displayed above the fireplace. It showed Harold Hayes standing beside the newly completed mansion almost 50 years earlier, smiling proudly beneath the shade of two young oak trees that had since grown taller than the roof itself. Eleanor gently straightened the silver frame before continuing her work. Victoria entered the library carrying a real estate brochure. "The developers are offering an extraordinary price," she announced to Michael. "If we remove the old gardens and build luxury homes across the south field, the estate will be worth nearly twice as much." Michael nodded thoughtfully. The lawyer should finalize everything next week. Eleanor remained quietly polishing the antique desk. Without looking toward her, Victoria casually added, "Once the paperwork is finished, we will probably not need full-time household staff anymore. You should begin thinking about your next job." The word settled into the room with surprising coldness. Olivia looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Eleanor slowly folded the polishing cloth in her hands before answering with calm politeness. "Thank you for your concern." Victoria seemed almost disappointed by the lack of reaction. She had expected sadness, perhaps fear. Instead she received quiet composure. As the family left the room, Eleanor carefully opened one small desk drawer that no one else ever touched. Inside rested a neatly organized leather notebook, several old brass keys, and a faded handwritten letter sealed with dark blue wax. She gently checked that everything remained exactly where it belonged before locking the drawer once again. Then she returned to dusting the bookshelves as though nothing unusual had happened. Outside, the autumn wind quietly rustled through the ancient oak trees surrounding the mansion. Inside, every member of the Hayes family believed they fully understood the elderly woman they called the housekeeper. None of them noticed that the keys hanging from her apron unlocked far more than kitchen cabinets and storage rooms, and none of them imagined that before another week had passed, the first person the family lawyer intended to greet inside the mansion would not be the wealthy heirs waiting to inherit everything, but the quiet woman everyone had spent years pretending not to see. The days that followed unfolded with the same quiet rhythm that had defined Eleanor's life for decades, yet beneath the polished floors and carefully trimmed gardens, the atmosphere inside the Hayes estate grew increasingly tense. Every breakfast conversation ended with another discussion about lawyers, appraisals, tax estimates, or redevelopment plans. Victoria spoke confidently about transforming the South Gardens into luxury residences, while Michael calculated projected profits on spreadsheets that seemed to grow larger every day. To them, the mansion had become an investment waiting to be divided. To Eleanor, it remained a home built from promises that could never be measured in dollars. Early one Wednesday morning she carried a basket of freshly cut roses from the greenhouse toward the grand foyer. The enormous entrance hall was lined with portraits of generations of the Hayes family, each carefully illuminated by warm sunlight pouring through towering windows. Without looking at the engraved nameplates, Eleanor adjusted one slightly crooked frame before continuing toward the dining room. Olivia happened to notice. "I never remember which great-grandfather that is," she admitted with a smile. Eleanor glanced toward the portrait. "That is Charles Hayes. He commissioned the Eastern Wing after returning from military service in 1952. The library fireplace was built using stone he selected himself from a nearby quarry." Olivia looked genuinely surprised. "How do you remember all that?" Before Eleanor could answer, Victoria entered carrying architectural blueprints. "Because she has worked here forever," she interrupted dismissively. "When you spend enough years dusting family photographs, eventually you memorize the captions." Eleanor simply smiled politely and continued arranging flowers without correcting her. Later that afternoon a delivery truck arrived carrying several expensive display boards prepared by a development company interested in purchasing part of the estate. The driver struggled to maneuver the oversized crates through the front entrance. Michael studied the shipment with visible frustration. "They should have used the west service entrance," he muttered. Eleanor quietly stepped forward. "Those crates will not fit through the west corridor. The ceiling narrows by nearly 6 inches after the second archway. The original builders reduced the width when they reinforced the chimney foundation." Michael frowned. "How do you know that?" Eleanor answered calmly. "Because it has always been that way." He dismissed the explanation with a shrug until the workers measured both entrances and confirmed she was exactly right. The crates eventually entered through the main hall without difficulty. Nobody thanked her. They simply continued unloading as though her knowledge were somehow ordinary. That evening Eleanor walked slowly through the mansion after everyone had gone upstairs. She checked every window lock, extinguished decorative candles, adjusted the grandfather clock in the hallway, and paused briefly inside the estate library. There she unlocked the same small desk drawer she had quietly checked the day before. This time she removed the faded leather notebook and opened it carefully. Every page contained neat handwritten entries documenting decades of repairs, restoration projects, charitable donations, maintenance records, and family milestones. Each entry was signed by Harold Hayes in blue ink beside Eleanor's own careful handwriting. The final page ended only months before Harold's passing. At the bottom, beneath his unmistakable signature, appeared one final sentence. The house remains safest in the hands of the person who has loved it the longest. Eleanor gently closed the notebook before returning it to its exact position inside the locked drawer. The following morning, several longtime gardeners arrived to maintain the expansive grounds surrounding the mansion. Their supervisor, an elderly man named Thomas, removed his cap as Eleanor approached with fresh lemonade for the crew. "Good morning," he said respectfully. "Everything looks beautiful as always." Eleanor smiled warmly. "Thank you, Thomas. The north rose beds may need extra attention before the first frost." Victoria happened to overhear the exchange while walking toward her car. After Thomas returned to work, she laughed lightly. "I have always wondered why everyone around town calls you. You really have trained the entire county to treat you like royalty." Eleanor simply answered, "Respect usually reflects the character of the person offering it." Victoria barely listened before driving away for another meeting with the property developers. Olivia, however, quietly remembered the exchange. Throughout the day she began noticing other small details that suddenly seemed unusual. Delivery drivers greeted Eleanor by name before greeting anyone else. Local contractors asked for her approval before discussing repairs. Even the antique piano tuner sought her opinion about the original finish before beginning his work. None of these people behaved as though she were merely an employee. They treated her with the quiet respect usually reserved for someone carrying genuine authority. That evening, Michael invited several financial advisors to review projected redevelopment plans inside the formal dining room. Maps, contracts, and architectural drawings covered nearly every inch of the polished walnut table. As the discussion continued, one consultant pointed toward a narrow section of woodland bordering the eastern property line. "We should include this acreage in the proposal." Eleanor happened to be passing through with a tray of coffee. She paused only long enough to say quietly, "That section cannot be developed. There is a permanent conservation easement recorded against the land." Michael looked up impatiently. "We have reviewed every document." Eleanor answered with calm certainty. "Then perhaps one document has not yet been found." She continued walking without another word, leaving the advisors exchanging puzzled glances. Michael dismissed her comment with a wave of his hand, convinced that legal matters belong to attorneys, not housekeepers. Yet somewhere deep inside the mansion, hidden behind locked drawers, forgotten records, and promises made long before any of the current heirs imagined owning the estate, waited a truth that Eleanor had faithfully protected for decades, knowing the day would eventually arrive when someone finally asked not what she cleaned, but what she had been quietly guarding all along. Friday morning arrived wrapped in a light autumn mist that settled gently across the rolling lawns surrounding the Hayes estate. Eleanor unlocked the greenhouse just as she had done every Friday for more than 3 decades, carefully watering orchids that had once been Margaret Hayes's favorite flowers. Each plant occupied the exact place it had always stood, not because anyone instructed her to preserve the arrangement, but because she quietly believed some promises deserved to survive the passing of time. By the time she carried fresh arrangements into the mansion, the family had already gathered in the breakfast room discussing another meeting with developers scheduled later that afternoon. Victoria unfolded glossy architectural renderings across the polished table. "Once the contracts are signed, the old carriage house will be demolished first," she announced confidently. "Nobody uses it anymore." Eleanor paused only long enough to place a vase of white lilies at the center of the table. "The carriage house should not be removed," she said gently. Michael barely looked up from his tablet. "Why not?" Eleanor answered in the same calm voice she always used. "Some buildings remain standing because they protect more than themselves." Victoria laughed lightly. "It is an empty storage building full of old furniture." Eleanor simply nodded and quietly returned to the kitchen. Olivia watched her leave with growing curiosity. The older woman never argued, yet every answer somehow sounded less like an opinion and more like a fact patiently waiting to be understood. Later that morning, Olivia wandered through the mansion searching for an old family cookbook she remembered seeing somewhere in the library. Unable to locate it, she eventually found Eleanor polishing bookshelves beneath the tall walnut cabinets. Miss Eleanor, she asked softly, do you happen to know where grandmother kept the blue cookbook? Eleanor smiled. Third shelf behind the leather history collection. It is hidden inside a carved wooden box because your grandmother worried sunlight would fade the handwritten recipes. Olivia looked surprised. She walked exactly where Eleanor directed her and gently pulled aside several antique books. Hidden behind them sat the carved wooden box exactly as described. Inside rested the blue cookbook untouched by time. Olivia carried it back with wide eyes. How did you know? Eleanor brushed a little dust from the shelf before answering. Your grandmother liked surprises. She showed me nearly every hiding place in this house because she believed memories deserved careful guardians. Before Olivia could ask another question, Victoria called from the hallway asking everyone to prepare for the developer's visit. Throughout the afternoon, expensive suits filled the mansion. Real estate consultants, financial planners, surveyors, and investors walked from room to room discussing profit margins and redevelopment opportunities. Eleanor quietly served coffee while conversations floated through the grand dining room. One consultant stopped before a large oil painting hanging above the fireplace. This piece should be auctioned separately, he suggested. Collectors would pay a remarkable amount. Eleanor politely corrected him without raising her voice. That painting cannot be removed. The consultant smiled politely. Everything has a market value. Eleanor looked toward the painting. Perhaps. But it was designed as part of the original wall structure. Removing it would damage the hidden chamber behind the stonework. Every conversation stopped. Michael frowned. Hidden chamber? Eleanor answered calmly. The original architect incorporated one during construction nearly 50 years ago. Several consultants exchanged skeptical glances. Michael stepped toward the fireplace and examined the surrounding stone. There is no chamber. Eleanor simply pointed toward a nearly invisible carved oak leaf built into the molding. Press there. Michael hesitated before doing exactly that. A quiet mechanical click echoed through the room. Slowly, a narrow stone panel shifted several inches inward, revealing a small hidden compartment lined with cedar wood. Inside rested only a few empty document cases and an old brass lantern, but the existence of the chamber left every visitor speechless. Michael stared in disbelief. How did you know this existed? Eleanor answered as though discussing ordinary housekeeping. Mr. Hayes showed it to me many years ago during a restoration project. Victoria folded her arms. Why would father show something like this to a housekeeper? Eleanor smiled gently without answering. She quietly closed the hidden compartment before returning to collect empty coffee cups as though revealing secret rooms inside the mansion were no more remarkable than arranging flowers. That evening the consultants departed, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. For the first time, Michael began questioning assumptions he had never bothered to examine. How could someone employed only to clean know the architectural history of the estate better than licensed surveyors? Why did long-time contractors seek her approval before beginning repairs? Why did she possess detailed knowledge of rooms even family members had never seen? After dinner, Olivia stepped onto the rear terrace where Eleanor sat watching the sunset color the hills beyond the estate. May I ask you something? Olivia said quietly. Eleanor nodded warmly. Of course. Olivia hesitated before speaking. Who are you really? Eleanor looked across the gardens glowing beneath the fading evening light. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses through the quiet air. After several thoughtful moments, she smiled with the same quiet grace that had carried her through decades of misunderstanding. I am exactly who I have always been, she answered softly. The difference is that sometimes people need the right moment before they are willing to see someone clearly. As darkness settled over the estate, the mansion remained filled with unanswered questions, and somewhere beyond the front gates, a distinguished attorney named Daniel Brooks was already preparing the leather briefcases containing documents that would soon explain why the quiet woman everyone called the housekeeper had never truly been serving the house at all. Saturday morning arrived with unusual energy inside the Hayes estate. Sunlight poured through the towering windows while staff from a prestigious law office arranged additional chairs inside the grand drawing room. Michael had insisted that everyone be present for what he confidently described as the final legal review before transferring ownership of the estate into the family's names. Victoria appeared especially pleased. She wore an expensive tailored suit, reviewed property valuations one final time, and spoke enthusiastically about renovation schedules and meetings with developers. By this time next month, she announced while examining another set of blueprints, construction crews will already be preparing the south gardens. Michael nodded with satisfaction. The sooner everything is finalized, the sooner we stop spending money maintaining this oversized museum. Eleanor quietly entered carrying a silver tray with fresh coffee and warm pastries arranged exactly as Harold Hayes had preferred during every important family meeting. She carefully placed each cup before the guests without interrupting their conversation. As she reached Victoria, the older woman glanced briefly toward the tray before speaking with casual indifference. There is no reason to polish the silver anymore. Most of it will probably be sold after the transfer. Eleanor simply smiled politely. Very well. Olivia watched the exchange in uncomfortable silence. Over the past several days she had begun seeing Eleanor differently. The hidden room, the forgotten cookbook, the architectural knowledge, and the quiet respect shown by everyone outside the immediate family had planted questions she could no longer ignore. She quietly followed Eleanor into the kitchen a few minutes later. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Eleanor looked up from arranging fresh fruit inside crystal bowls. "Of course." Olivia hesitated. "Victoria should not speak to you that way." Eleanor smiled warmly. People usually speak according to what they understand. Sometimes understanding arrives later than kindness. Before Olivia could answer, the front gate intercom chimed. Michael checked the security monitor and smiled confidently. The attorneys are early. Everyone gradually gathered inside the drawing room overlooking the expansive front lawn. Eleanor quietly remained near the doorway, hands folded calmly before her apron, saying nothing. Outside, several luxury vehicles entered through the iron gates one after another before stopping along the circular driveway. The family expected a routine legal meeting. Instead they noticed something unusual. Two assistants carefully carried large archival storage cases instead of ordinary briefcases. Victoria whispered, "Why would they need that many files?" Michael shrugged. "Probably estate records." The vehicles had barely stopped when Eleanor quietly walked toward the entrance hall. Without looking hurried, she unlocked the massive front doors herself and stood waiting as the guests approached. Moments later the first assistant entered carrying leather document boxes. Behind him walked Daniel Brooks, the longtime Hayes family attorney, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit with silver hair neatly combed and several leather portfolios tucked beneath one arm. Michael stepped forward immediately with a welcoming smile. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. We have everything ready." Daniel acknowledged him politely with a brief nod but continued walking without slowing his pace. Victoria extended her hand next. "It is wonderful to finally complete Father's estate." Daniel again offered only a courteous nod before continuing directly across the marble foyer. Every conversation inside the mansion suddenly became quiet as he stopped only a few feet from Eleanor. Without hesitation, Daniel gently lowered the leather portfolios onto a nearby table before extending both hands toward the elderly woman. His voice carried unmistakable warmth and deep respect. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks. I apologize for keeping you waiting." Complete silence filled the foyer. Michael stared in confusion. Victoria looked from the attorney to Eleanor as though she had misunderstood what she had just heard. Olivia remained completely still, her earlier suspicions suddenly feeling very real. Daniel continued speaking with quiet professionalism. "I have brought every document you requested, including the original trust records, restoration agreements, conservation files, and the founder's personal correspondence." Eleanor smiled gently. "Thank you, Daniel. I trust your journey was comfortable." "Very comfortable," he replied. "Everything has been prepared exactly as Mr. Harold Hayes instructed." Michael finally interrupted, unable to hide his confusion. "Excuse me," he said cautiously. Why are you addressing our housekeeper as Mrs. Brooks? Daniel slowly turned toward the family, his expression remaining calm and composed. He looked briefly at Eleanor before answering. Because that is her name. Victoria forced a nervous laugh. We know her name. What we mean is, why are you discussing legal files with household staff? Daniel's expression did not change. Because none of these documents can be reviewed until Mrs. Eleanor Brooks has examined them first. The room became impossibly still. Eleanor quietly stepped beside the polished walnut table while Daniel carefully unlocked the first archival case using a small brass key. Inside rested dozens of leather-bound ledgers, original property deeds, sealed trust documents, and handwritten journals dating back generations. Michael looked from the documents to Eleanor, suddenly realizing that the quiet woman he had watched preparing breakfast only an hour earlier was standing before the estate's most trusted attorney as though they had conducted meetings like this many times before. For the first time since Harold Hayes passed away, certainty disappeared from every heir's face, replaced by one unmistakable question that none of them yet possessed the courage to ask. Michael looked toward Daniel Brooks with growing disbelief, convinced there had to be some simple explanation. I believe there has been a misunderstanding, he said carefully. Eleanor has worked for this family for decades. She manages the house. Daniel calmly folded his hands before answering. She has certainly managed the house. That statement is entirely correct. What you do not understand is why. The attorney opened the first leather-bound ledger and placed it gently on the polished walnut table. Inside were meticulously organized financial records spanning more than 30 years. Every page contained handwritten notes, maintenance schedules, restoration expenses, charitable donations, insurance renewals, tax filings, and preservation reports. Beside nearly every entry appeared two signatures. One belonged to Harold Hayes. The other belonged to Eleanor Brooks. Victoria stepped closer and frowned. Why would father require her signature? Daniel looked directly at her. Because Mr. Harold Hayes appointed Mrs. Eleanor Brooks as the legal trustee responsible for preserving the estate according to the terms of the Hayes Family Heritage Trust. The room fell completely silent. Michael stared at the documents before shaking his head. That is impossible. Father never mentioned any trust. Daniel answered without emotion. Many responsibilities of a trustee are intentionally private until specific legal conditions have been satisfied. He carefully removed another folder sealed with dark blue wax. The trust was established 28 years ago after extensive consultation with Mr. Hayes, several preservation attorneys, and the family's financial advisors. Olivia quietly looked toward Eleanor, who remained standing with remarkable composure. She neither celebrated nor defended herself. She simply listened. Daniel continued. Under the trust agreement, Mrs. Brooks became the legal guardian of the estate's historical preservation, charitable commitments, conservation easements, restoration projects, and archival records. No major structural modification, sale of protected land, demolition, or transfer of designated historical property could occur without her written authorization. Victoria laughed nervously. That cannot possibly be legal. Daniel calmly slid another certified document across the table. It has been reviewed by the Tennessee Probate Court, the State Historical Preservation Office, and every attorney representing Mr. Hayes during the past 28 years. Michael picked up the document with visibly trembling hands. Every official seal appeared authentic. Every signature belonged exactly where it should. He slowly lowered the papers back onto the table. Why would father choose her? Daniel answered quietly. Because she was the only person he trusted to protect the estate after he was gone. Eleanor gently lowered her eyes, remembering the conversation that had taken place years earlier inside the library after a severe storm damaged the eastern roof. Harold had quietly told her that buildings survived because someone loved them enough to care for them every day, not because someone inherited them. Daniel opened another archive box and carefully removed dozens of restoration photographs. Each showed Eleanor overseeing repairs alongside architects, structural engineers, historians, roof specialists, and conservation experts throughout the years. Victoria stared in disbelief. You supervised all of this. Eleanor answered softly. The professionals performed the work. I simply made sure Mr. Hayes's wishes were honored. Daniel nodded. Every restoration was approved jointly by Mr. Hayes and Mrs. Brooks. Every contractor answered to her regarding preservation standards. Every historical artifact catalogued inside this mansion was documented under her supervision. Michael slowly looked around the enormous drawing room that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Every polished floor, restored fireplace, preserved painting, repaired roof beam, and carefully maintained garden represented decades of work he had never noticed because someone else quietly ensured everything always remained perfect. Olivia gently asked the question none of them had considered before. Were you ever actually employed here? Eleanor smiled kindly before answering. Many years ago, I accepted the position of housekeeper because it allowed me to remain close to the house while carrying out my responsibilities. Titles rarely matter as much as the work itself. Daniel reached into the final archive case and removed a faded leather portfolio. There is something else you should understand. He carefully opened the portfolio to reveal the original trust appointment signed by Harold Hayes nearly 3 decades earlier. Attached was a handwritten letter. Daniel looked toward Eleanor. Would you prefer to read this? She quietly shook her head. Harold intended his family to hear it from you. Daniel unfolded the letter with obvious care. My family may someday mistake ownership for responsibility. If that day comes, remind them that a house becomes a home only because someone chooses to care for it every single day. Eleanor Brooks has protected this estate with greater loyalty than anyone could ever purchase. She has earned my complete trust, and after my passing, no decision affecting this home shall move forward without her judgment. If my children truly love what I leave behind, they will first learn to respect the woman who spent decades preserving it for them. Daniel slowly lowered the letter. No one spoke. Victoria's confident posture quietly disappeared. Michael looked toward Eleanor with an expression no longer shaped by superiority but by confusion and regret. Olivia's eyes filled gently with emotion as years of overlooked kindness suddenly formed a picture she could finally understand. Eleanor remained exactly as she had been that morning while serving breakfast, humble, composed, and almost invisible, except now every person inside the mansion had begun seeing what had always been standing quietly before them. No one moved for what felt like an entire minute. The silence inside the drawing room seemed almost sacred, interrupted only by the faint ticking of the antique grandfather clock that had stood beside the fireplace since the mansion was first completed. Michael slowly lowered Harold Hayes's handwritten letter onto the polished table, reading its final lines once more as though repetition might somehow change their meaning. It did not. Victoria looked toward Eleanor with an expression she had never worn before. The certainty that had shaped every decision during the past year had quietly disappeared, replaced by uncomfortable self-reflection. Daniel Brooks carefully organized the trust documents before speaking again. There is one final matter that must be understood before we continue. Everyone looked toward him. He opened another leather folder and removed several detailed maps of the estate. Colored markings identified protected gardens, conservation easements, historical structures, woodland boundaries, and restoration zones. Daniel pointed toward the southern fields that Victoria had already promised to developers. These 68 acres may never be sold for residential construction. Michael frowned. Because of the conservation easement Eleanor mentioned. Daniel nodded. Yes. The easement became permanent 23 years ago. Mrs. Brooks personally negotiated the agreement with state officials after Mr. Hayes requested that the land remain untouched for future generations. Victoria stared at the map. The developers already spent months preparing proposals. Daniel answered calmly. Those proposals were never legally possible. Michael looked toward Eleanor. You knew this the entire time. Eleanor answered gently. Yes. Why did you never stop us? She folded her hands quietly before replying. No one asked whether the plans were possible. You only asked how profitable they might become. Her words carried no accusation. They were spoken with quiet honesty, making them even more difficult to ignore. Daniel removed another group of photographs from the archive case. They showed volunteers planting hundreds of young trees across the southern property many years earlier. Harold Hayes stood among them beside Eleanor, both smiling beneath bright spring sunlight. These photographs were taken during the establishment of the Hayes Conservation Grove, Daniel explained. The grove honors Margaret Hayes's lifelong commitment to environmental education. Mrs. Brooks supervised every planting project after Mrs. Hayes became too ill to continue. Olivia looked carefully through the photographs before noticing children from local schools planting small oak trees beside community volunteers. "I remember hearing about this when I was little," she whispered. Eleanor smiled softly. "Your mother planted one of those trees with you when you were 4 years old." Olivia looked surprised. "You remember that?" Eleanor nodded. "You insisted your oak tree needed a name before it could grow properly. You called it Hope." Olivia laughed quietly through gathering tears. "I had forgotten." Eleanor's smile grew warmer. The tree never forgot. Daniel continued opening additional files. Every folder revealed another responsibility Eleanor had quietly carried for decades. Scholarship foundations funded by the estate. Annual donations to the local hospital. Church restoration grants. Community food pantry support. Historic preservation partnerships. Insurance renewals protecting priceless family heirlooms. Every document bore Eleanor's careful signature beside Harold Hayes's own. Michael slowly leaned back into his chair. "Father trusted you with everything." Eleanor looked toward Harold's portrait hanging above the fireplace. "He trusted me to remember why the estate existed." Victoria spoke more quietly than anyone had ever heard her. "And what was the reason?" Eleanor answered without hesitation. "Never to impress people. Always to serve them." The word settled deeply into the room. For years the family had measured the mansion by market value, square footage, and investment potential. Eleanor had measured it by weddings celebrated inside its walls, scholarships awarded through its foundation, meals served to neighbors after storms, holiday gatherings, charity events, and promises quietly kept long after cameras disappeared. Daniel carefully closed several archive boxes before reaching for one final envelope sealed with dark green wax. "There remains one last instruction from Mr. Hayes." He handed the envelope directly to Eleanor. She accepted it gently but made no effort to open it. Michael looked at her with genuine curiosity. "You have never read it?" Eleanor shook her head. "Harold instructed me to wait until every member of his family understood the purpose of the trust before opening his final letter." Victoria slowly lowered her eyes. "I do not think we understood until today." Eleanor remained silent for several thoughtful moments before carefully breaking the wax seal. Inside rested only a single handwritten page. She quietly read the first lines to herself before looking toward Daniel. "He wanted me to read this aloud." Daniel nodded respectfully. Eleanor's voice remained calm as she began. "If this letter is being read, then my family has finally learned that stewardship is greater than ownership. Eleanor, if they are listening with open hearts, tell them something I learned too late in life. The people who quietly protect our blessings are often the ones we notice the least. Never allow gratitude to arrive only after someone is gone. Teach them to care for this home together, not because it belongs to them, but because someday it will belong to those who come after them." Eleanor slowly lowered the letter. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished wooden floor, illuminating the old family portraits that had silently witnessed generations of triumphs, failures, and second chances. For the first time since Harold Hayes's passing, no one inside the mansion spoke about inheritance, development, or financial gain. Instead they quietly looked around the home with new eyes, beginning to understand that the greatest treasure Harold had left behind had never been hidden inside a bank account or locked inside a safe. It had been quietly walking through these halls every single morning carrying fresh flowers, serving breakfast, protecting promises, and patiently waiting for the day the family finally learned to recognize the true guardian of everything they believed they owned. The atmosphere inside the Hayes estate changed in ways that no renovation project or legal document ever could. The mansion itself remained exactly as it had been the day before, with its polished walnut floors, towering windows, antique chandeliers, and carefully preserved gardens, yet every familiar room suddenly carried a different meaning. Michael wandered quietly through the library where he had spent countless evenings reviewing financial reports. For the first time, however, he noticed details he had ignored for years. Every leather-bound book had been carefully restored. Every brass lamp gleamed without a trace of neglect. Every family photograph stood perfectly centered. Nothing inside the estate had remained beautiful by accident. Someone had quietly loved this place every single day. He paused before Harold Hayes's portrait hanging above the fireplace. "I thought I understood what mattered to you," he whispered softly. "I was wrong." Meanwhile, Victoria slowly walked through the formal garden surrounding the southern lawn. The colorful flower beds stretched toward the old conservation grove where hundreds of mature oak trees now stood proudly against the bright autumn sky. She remembered dismissing the area as unused land only days earlier. Now, after learning why the grove existed, every tree seemed to represent one of her father's promises rather than another missed business opportunity. She noticed Eleanor kneeling near one of the flower beds, carefully removing a few fallen leaves from around newly planted roses. Victoria approached hesitantly. For perhaps the first time since they had known one another, she did not speak first with authority. "May I help you?" she asked quietly. Eleanor looked up with gentle surprise before smiling warmly. "Of course." Victoria accepted a pair of gardening gloves Eleanor handed her. Neither woman spoke for several minutes as they worked side by side beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. Finally Victoria broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Eleanor continued loosening the soil around the roses before answering. "What makes you believe that?" Victoria lowered her eyes. "Because I spent years believing I understood your place in this family without ever asking who you truly were." Eleanor gently shook her head. "We all see only part of another person's story. That is simply part of being human." Victoria looked toward her with quiet emotion. "How did you never become bitter?" Eleanor smiled thoughtfully. "Harold once told me that bitterness asks us to carry someone else's mistake long after they have forgotten making it. I decided many years ago that it was too heavy to carry." Across the estate, Olivia wandered toward the old carriage house Eleanor had defended only days before. Curious now, she slowly opened its weathered wooden doors. Instead of abandoned furniture, she discovered carefully preserved workbenches, original architectural drawings, restoration tools, handwritten journals, framed newspaper articles, and hundreds of labeled storage boxes documenting nearly every repair ever completed on the estate. Each shelf had been organized with extraordinary precision. Mounted on one wall hung a large photograph showing Harold Hayes, Margaret Hayes, Eleanor, and dozens of local volunteers restoring storm damage many years earlier. Olivia quietly smiled as she realized the carriage house had never been ordinary storage. It had always been the heart of the estate's preservation work. Daniel Brooks entered quietly behind her. "Beautiful, is it not?" Olivia nodded. "I had no idea." Daniel smiled gently. "Most people never did. Mrs. Brooks preferred it that way." Olivia slowly traced her fingers across one of the restoration journals. "Did my grandfather really trust her this much?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "More than anyone else." He paused before continuing. "Not because she asked for responsibility, but because she never once sought recognition." Back inside the mansion, Michael entered the kitchen where Eleanor was preparing dinner exactly as she had every evening for decades. He stood awkwardly near the doorway, uncertain how to begin. Finally he spoke. "May I ask you something?" Eleanor looked up from chopping fresh vegetables. "Certainly." Michael hesitated before saying the words that felt unfamiliar. "Would you teach me?" Eleanor smiled softly. "Teach you what?" "How to take care of this place the way my father wanted." Eleanor set down the kitchen knife and studied his face carefully. She recognized something she had quietly hoped would arrive one day, not perfection, but willingness. Tomorrow morning, she said kindly, meet me in the greenhouse before sunrise. Michael looked surprised. The greenhouse? Eleanor nodded. Every lesson about protecting this estate begins there. He smiled for the first time that afternoon. I will be there. As evening settled across the Hayes estate, the family gathered for dinner around the same long walnut table where countless conversations about inheritance had recently taken place. Tonight the discussion felt entirely different. There were no blueprints spread across the polished wood. No financial projections. No arguments over property values. Instead, Olivia asked Eleanor about Margaret's favorite flowers. Victoria wanted to hear stories about the early years of the mansion. Michael listened quietly while Daniel explained how Harold had personally participated in restoration projects alongside local craftsmen. Eleanor answered every question with quiet humility, never placing herself at the center of any story. She always returned the credit to Harold, Margaret, volunteers, neighbors, or generations of people who had cared for the estate before her. As laughter slowly returned to rooms that had grown cold with greed, the mansion itself seemed somehow lighter, as though the walls had been patiently waiting for the family to remember that homes are not preserved by ownership alone. They endure because ordinary people choose, day after day, to protect what they love without asking whether anyone is watching. The next morning Michael arrived at the greenhouse nearly 30 minutes before sunrise, unsure whether Eleanor had expected him to take her invitation seriously. A thin layer of mist drifted across the gardens while the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky with soft shades of gold and pale blue. He found Eleanor already inside the greenhouse, carefully watering rows of orchids, roses, and young oak seedlings. She smiled as he entered. "You are early." Michael glanced around the glass structure filled with life and quiet beauty. "I wanted to make a good first impression." Eleanor handed him a pair of well-worn gardening gloves. "Then begin by carrying those watering cans." Michael obeyed without hesitation. The metal containers felt heavier than he expected, and before long his expensive dress shoes were covered with damp soil. Eleanor noticed him looking down and smiled gently. "The earth never cares what shoes we wear." Michael laughed softly, realizing it was the first genuine laugh he had shared with her. As they worked side by side, Eleanor explained that every flower bed around the mansion had been planted according to Margaret Hayes's original handwritten garden journals. Every tree carried a record describing when it had been planted, who had cared for it, and why it mattered. "A garden survives because someone pays attention to small things every single day," Eleanor said quietly. Homes are no different. Later that morning Daniel Brooks joined them carrying another leather folder. "There is one final matter Harold wished to complete," he explained. The three of them walked toward the library where Victoria and Olivia were already waiting. Daniel carefully unfolded a large parchment drawing of the estate. Unlike the modern development maps, this one showed the property exactly as it had appeared nearly 50 years earlier. Harold had written notes along the edges in neat blue ink. Daniel pointed toward different sections while reading aloud. "This orchard honors Margaret's parents. The western meadow supports the annual community harvest festival. The southern grove belongs to future generations. The library remains open every Christmas for local children's reading programs. The carriage house preserves the estate's restoration archives. Every piece of land carried a purpose beyond ownership." Victoria quietly studied the map before looking toward Eleanor. "You remembered every one of these promises?" Eleanor nodded. "Someone needed to." Daniel then produced a small wooden box that had remained sealed until that morning. Inside rested dozens of brass keys attached to handwritten labels. Each key opened a different section of the estate: storage rooms, archives, maintenance vaults, irrigation systems, historical collections, and restoration workshops. Daniel placed the box before Eleanor. "According to the trust, these keys remain under your authority unless you believe the family is ready to share the responsibility." Eleanor looked at the three siblings for a long moment before gently lifting the first key. She handed it to Michael. "The greenhouse." She placed another into Victoria's hand. "The conservation grove." A third key went to Olivia. The family archives. Finally, she kept only one small brass key for herself. Olivia looked puzzled. Which room does yours open? Eleanor smiled softly. The original library desk. Until every document has been properly transferred, someone must still protect the records. Daniel nodded approvingly. Exactly as Harold intended. During the following weeks, the estate slowly transformed, not through expensive renovations but through renewed purpose. Michael cancelled every development agreement and began working alongside preservation specialists instead of investors. Victoria organized charity events that brought neighbors back onto the grounds for the first time in years. Olivia carefully catalogued family photographs, journals, and historical records under Eleanor's patient guidance. Every morning they met together before breakfast to review the day's work, and every evening they shared dinner around the same walnut table where arguments about inheritance had once dominated every conversation. The staff also noticed the difference. Gardeners, cooks, maintenance workers, and volunteers were greeted by name. Gratitude replaced entitlement. Laughter gradually returned to hallways that had grown quiet after Harold's passing. One afternoon, several local school children arrived for the annual conservation program that Harold had established decades earlier. Michael welcomed them personally while Victoria distributed gardening gloves. Olivia led a tour through the restored Carriage House Museum. Eleanor watched from beneath the shade of the old oak trees as dozens of young students planted new saplings beside the original grove. Daniel quietly joined her. You fulfilled every promise you made to Harold. Eleanor looked toward the children laughing together beneath the autumn sky. No, she answered gently. We fulfilled them. Daniel smiled knowingly. You still refuse to take the credit. Eleanor shook her head. A good steward leaves behind healthy trees, strong homes, and grateful people. Recognition is never part of the harvest. As the afternoon sunlight settled across the Hayes estate, the mansion stood more beautiful than ever, not because its stone walls had changed, but because the hearts within them finally had. The family who once believed they owned everything had learned instead that the greatest inheritance is not property, wealth, or titles. It is the wisdom to recognize quiet faithfulness before it is too late, and the humility to continue protecting what others spent a lifetime preserving with love. Nearly 1 year later, the Hayes estate welcomed another autumn morning beneath the same towering oak trees that had watched over generations of family history. The mansion looked unchanged from the outside, its stone walls glowing warmly beneath the rising sun, yet anyone walking through its doors could immediately feel that something profoundly different had taken root. Fresh flowers greeted every visitor in the entrance hall. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. The library doors stood open instead of closed. The gardens flourished with renewed life, and neighbors once again treated the estate not as a symbol of wealth, but as a place where generosity quietly lived. Eleanor Brooks unlocked the greenhouse before sunrise just as she always had. She still carried the familiar brass key on a simple ring attached to her apron, although she no longer wore the title everyone had once assumed belonged to her. The family had repeatedly encouraged her to move into the main residence and accept a more distinguished position. Eleanor had smiled each time and politely declined. I have never needed a different title, she would gently say. Only good people willing to continue the work. That morning she found Michael already watering the young oak saplings before she arrived. He looked up with an easy smile. I thought I might finally surprise you. Eleanor laughed softly. You almost did. Victoria soon appeared carrying fresh pastries from the local bakery. Gone was the hurried executive who measured every decision by financial return. She now organized annual scholarship dinners inside the mansion, raising funds for local students exactly as Harold and Margaret Hayes had once envisioned. Olivia followed close behind with several carefully preserved family journals tucked beneath one arm. She had spent the past year creating a historical archive documenting the estate's legacy so future generations would never again mistake property for purpose. As the morning unfolded, dozens of volunteers from the surrounding community arrived for the annual Hayes Heritage Day, an event that had quietly disappeared after Harold's passing but now flourished once more. Families planted trees together, children learned local history beneath the conservation grove, musicians performed on the southern lawn, and retired craftsmen demonstrated traditional woodworking techniques inside the restored carriage house. Eleanor walked slowly among the visitors, greeting familiar faces with quiet warmth. Many thanked her for preserving the estate. She always redirected the praise toward everyone around her. Many hands protect a home, she would say. Never only one. During the afternoon ceremony, Daniel Brooks stood before the gathered crowd holding a small wooden presentation box. There is one final item left unfinished by Harold Hayes, he announced. He invited Eleanor to join him beneath the oldest oak tree on the property, the very tree planted on the day construction of the mansion first began. Daniel opened the box, revealing a beautifully engraved bronze plaque. It read, "The Eleanor Brooks Stewardship Garden." Dedicated to the quiet courage, faithful service, and unwavering integrity that preserved the Hayes family legacy for generations. Eleanor looked at the inscription in complete silence before gently shaking her head. Harold would have preferred the garden remain unnamed. Daniel smiled kindly. Perhaps. But Harold also believed gratitude should be spoken while people are still able to hear it. Michael stepped forward first. "You taught me that ownership without responsibility is empty." Victoria followed. "You showed me that respect cannot be purchased." Olivia smiled through quiet tears. "And you reminded all of us that the strongest foundations are built by people who never ask for recognition." The gathered guests applauded warmly, not because of the plaque itself, but because everyone present understood the deeper meaning behind it. Eleanor accepted the honor with her usual humility before quietly asking if one small change could be made. Daniel looked surprised. "Of course." Eleanor smiled gently. "Remove my name." The crowd exchanged puzzled glances. She continued softly. "Call it the Stewardship Garden instead. Someday another person will care for this place after I am gone. They should know the garden belongs to the responsibility, never to the individual." Daniel paused before smiling with admiration. "I believe Harold would approve." The plaque was later replaced exactly as Eleanor requested. As the celebration drew to a close, the family gathered on the front porch overlooking the rolling Tennessee hills. The evening sky glowed with brilliant shades of orange and gold while the ancient oak tree swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Michael handed Eleanor a framed photograph taken earlier that afternoon. It showed volunteers, neighbors, children, craftsmen, and the Hayes family standing together beneath the conservation grove with smiling faces turned toward the camera. Eleanor studied the photograph for several quiet moments before whispering, "Now this finally looks like home." No one answered because no answer was necessary. They all understood that the greatest inheritance Harold Hayes had ever left behind had never been hidden inside legal documents, valuable antiques, or acres of protected land. It lived inside ordinary acts of kindness repeated faithfully across many years. It survived through quiet service, humble leadership, and the courage to value people above appearances. Long after the guests returned home and the lights inside the mansion slowly dimmed, the old estate stood peacefully beneath the stars, not as a monument to wealth, but as lasting proof that the people the world overlooks are often the very ones holding everything together, waiting patiently for truth to arrive and teach everyone else how to see.